Chapter 8, A Small Experiment. In the following excerpt, in a very low-key and conservative manner, Patriarch Knott first tells us a little something about himself, then lightly suggests an exercise, a work assignment. From Journey, page 186. Often my attention will be caught up by something or other in the stream of associations, physical, emotional, or mental, which begins at birth and never stops. Caught up in this stream, my attention would be dispersed in daydreaming, or in disputing with an imaginary person, or talking to myself. This stream of associations, called by psychologists the stream of consciousness, is really the stream of unconsciousness, since it flows on mechanically without our participating in it, unless we make a conscious effort to do so. What Patriarch Knott is talking about is the unfettered imagination. Almost everybody, especially these unfortunates, has one of those. Daydreaming is so common a thing that we usually do not even notice, or, if we notice, we think of it as normal, harmless behaviour. While it may be normal, it is not harmless. For those who are working on themselves, it is an impediment. It is one of our chief obstacles. This is not a popular topic, so we seldom hear much about it, and when we do, it is usually in the form of fiction or some light-hearted comedy, such as The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. But it is neither fiction nor comedy, and we are all Walter Mittys. One thing that has helped me take the matter of daydreaming more seriously is the realization that my wandering imagination, especially conversations with imaginary persons, is really nothing more than a so-called grown-up version of children playing with imaginary playmates. To see ourselves as grown men and women having conversations with our imaginary playmates is not a flattering image, and that is probably why we hear so little about it. But we do hear quite a lot from Gurdjieff and Patriarch Knott. Initially, this is one of the most important areas in work on ourselves, because control of the imagination will enable, but a lack of control will disable, all of our efforts with self-remembering, which is essential in completing higher bodies. The great importance of controlling the imagination is spelled out in various places in Gurdjieff's literal books, by which I mean books that are bound with a front and back cover, books that you can hold in your hand. But there are other, virtual books concealed within his literal books. Gurdjieff hints that he may someday write a book titled Dreams and Fantasies of People in the 20th Century. Another book he casually mentions is Dreams and Witchcraft. Actually, Gurdjieff wrote both of those books. They are, however, rather well concealed within his third series. We will see whether we can find those books, both of which are about daydreams of the unfettered imagination, and another type of dream, perhaps not so pleasant, before we are done. Dreams are made of much the same fabric no matter when or where they occur. Whether daydreams, night dreams, or the dreams we enjoy during the sleep we call death, they are all quite similar. If you learn to control or influence one type of dream, you will be in a good position to control the others. But I see that I am about to get ahead of myself, and so we will save the bardo dreams for later, while we return to the original focus of this chapter. On page 81 of Journey, Knott tells us a little about Gurdjieff's advice in the matter of daydreams and fantasy. In speaking about associations, he said we must let them flow. Without them we would die. Associations are a stick with two ends, a good end and a bad end. Some psychologists have called the flow of associations the stream of consciousness. Really, it is the stream of unconsciousness. We must be aware all the time and not let our attention be caught up in them, or we shall begin to daydream and fantasy, which is a sin. We have thousands of associations which are useless for our own being. And given a certain exercise, he said, treat your associations as another person. Say to them, let me do my work now, and you shall have your play later. Hartman also speaks of our uncontrolled imagination and adds a little about the benefit to our health gained by self-awareness. From Our Life, page 112. One feature that all the exercises have in common is that they require all our attention and so avoid the flow of uncontrolled associations that waste our life energy through very stupid, sometimes very painful, sometimes fantastic, sometimes erotic thoughts, feelings and sensations, which we all more or less experience. Mr. Gurdjieff frequently said that intentional suffering and conscious labour, by reducing this unconscious flow of associations, could prolong life. For those who work on attention and use it in the struggle with associations, who do not forget to remember themselves, for those people attention begins to be not only the centre of life, but also the factor which lengthens it. Self-awareness, the sensing of the whole of oneself, in the present moment, brings any daydream to a halt. When you become aware that you are in the middle of a fantasy, it stops, at least temporarily. It is important to learn to take advantage of those pauses. Gurdjieff's chief exercise will reinforce our self-awareness. In fact, in addition to feeding Kesjan body, the exercise is the embodiment of self-remembering. Performing the exercise requires and increases the inner ability which Gurdjieff says is more important than even air. While doing the exercise, you'll be practicing and increasing self-consciousness both physically and mentally. We will go into the health benefits Hartman mentioned in more detail in a later chapter. Now, in the excerpt at the beginning of this chapter, if you were alert, you noticed a suggestion. Patriarch Knott puts his suggestion to us in a very gentle form, but when he says the stream of thought flows on mechanically without our participation, unless we make a conscious effort to do so, he is subtly suggesting that we, you, make that conscious effort, and that is what this experiment is about. Find out how much the unfettered imagination affects you, and then determine why. Don't just speculate, don't estimate or guess, but measure and verify. This experiment gives you a good and veritable method for the efforts suggested by Patriarch Knott and is closely related to self-remembering. The initial procedure involves making a list. We often have trouble remembering things. For instance, before shopping for groceries or hardware and such, we find it useful to make a list of items we will need. Gurdjieff makes use of lists in Beelzebub's Tales, Meetings and Life is Real, and he repeatedly recommended using lists and written reminders to his pupils in Paris. This experiment is a combination of Gurdjieff's advice on making notes with Knott's advice to make conscious effort to control your imagination. We will use that advice to learn to control not only our daydreams, but some of our other dreams as well. Getting started is very simple. Make a list. Find a piece of paper, fold it to pocket size, then carry that paper or a small notebook and a pen with you, on your person, all day long. Each time you catch yourself in or coming out of a daydream, make a quick note of the time and 3 or 4 words about the subject of your fantasy. That's all. Don't think about it. Don't analyse or write a paragraph, just make a quick note. Then, at the end of the day, with full self-awareness, review your notes. You will likely see 2 recurrent themes, possibly 3, around which all your daydreams revolve. The characters and events in your fantasies will change, but the subjects will be variations on those same few themes over and over again. Why? What is the source of those themes, and what is it that compels us to fantasize on them? Well, it is your experiment, so it is your job to find the answers. But it helps to recall Gurdjieff's advice that the first volitional shock consists in self-remembering and in observing the impressions received. Observing the impressions received will of course include the recurrent themes of our daydreams. Those themes are a long-standing significant part of your psyche. What is their source? How did they come to be part of you? They did not come from Knott or Gurdjieff. They come from where? From whom? How long ago? This is the process, the method of self-questioning Gurdjieff mentioned in his dramatic introduction to Life is Real. I am... ... But what has become of that full sensing of the whole of myself, formerly always in me in just such cases of self-questioning during the process of self-remembering? When you begin remembering and self-questioning and continue until you identify the source of those themes, you will begin to understand why Gurdjieff likens self-remembering to consuming hot red peppers. By conducting this small experiment, you will be following the example of the Transcaucasian Kurd, and you will need to be as determined as he. You will also begin to understand a related matter, which is what Gurdjieff meant when he told Nott he must learn to repair the past. Nott mentions this several times, including on page 115 of Journey. I kept in mind Gurdjieff saying that one must pay for one's existence, fulfill one's destined lot, repair the past. Of course, to repair something, we must first identify it as in need of repair. This experiment is the beginning of repairing our past. This is not some quick fix solution to everything. To sort out the causes of your recurring themes and begin to make repairs may take a little time. But after only 1 or 2 days of note-taking, your work will no longer be abstract or theoretical, no longer drawn just from books. Your list will give you something personal and useful for real work on yourself. For best results, you may wish to repeat the experiment every week or every month for as long as it takes. So find a pen and a piece of paper and start your small experiment, even as you continue reading this book. The sooner you begin making your list, the sooner you will get results, and the sooner you'll be eating red pepper pods of your own. A dietary delicacy highly recommended by Gurdjieff. Chapter 9, a template found in a song. This chapter is written for your Mr. Personality, for you as opposed to your more real self. It is important to understand the necessity of the chief exercise, not only intuitively, but also at the level of your mind. You will need a strong conviction in this because, although motivated by essence and Gurdjieff, it is personality that will initially lead the way in performing the exercise, and you will need great strength of conviction for long-term stamina in your practice. You must be well informed and committed in all 3 of your totalities. Your 3rd totality is already looking forward to performing the chief exercise, and very much so. Essence also has real wish and hope for this ritual. For a full conviction in this, all that remains is to convince yourself consciously. So listen closely to what Gurdjieff says in the following excerpts. Several times in the preceding pages I've described our quarry as an ancient ritual exercise. Gurdjieff has something rather important to say about such rituals, indirectly and as usual in a discourse on a seemingly unrelated matter in which he does not identify by words his real subject. He does not use the word ritual, but as you will see, that is what his talk is about. In this excerpt, he covers some interesting but seemingly useless information on the tradition of the Ashoks, who were singers of ancient legends. I say seemingly useless because, as Gurdjieff notes, it is too late even for him, much less us, to gain further benefit from this tradition. But perhaps the Ashoks' practice of singing legends is just the example. If we ponder their practice and discern its inner structure, we may be able to benefit from that structure applied to a different modality even today. In Meetings with Remarkable Men, page 36, Gurdjieff tells us, "One day I read in a certain magazine an article in which it was said that there had been found among the ruins of Babylon some tablets with inscriptions which scholars were certain were no less than 4,000 years old. This magazine also printed the inscriptions and the deciphered text. It was the legend of the hero Gilgamesh. When I realised that here was that same legend which I had so often heard as a child from my father, and particularly when I read in this text the 21st song of the legend in almost the same form of exposition as in the songs and tales of my father, I experienced such an inner excitement that it was as if my whole future destiny depended on all this. And I was struck by the fact, at first inexplicable to me, that this legend has been handed down by Ashoks from generation to generation for thousands of years, and yet had reached our day almost unchanged. When Gurdjieff says, as if my whole future destiny depended on all this, he's playing the part of the example. He means our future destiny depends on all this, on what we take from it. In this section, Gurdjieff implicitly contrasts the oral transmission of truth, which in Beelzebub's tales he repeatedly demonstrates is so unreliable that by the third generation nothing useful remains, with the more reliable transmission of truths for over 4,000 years when transmitted in a certain form, one example of which is the Ashok's practice of putting their legends to song. The problem here is that we must pry that practice apart until we can see the underlying mechanisms at work, and that will require something Gurdjieff had already suggested, also by example, which is the study of neuropsychology. Now if, and only if you've done that study, the following material will be plain as day. Otherwise, you will not know what to think. Even if you believe what I say, that is of no use, because belief is cheap and leads nowhere. What you need to grasp Gurdjieff's teachings is to follow his advice and arm yourself with the recommended tools so that you can do more than just believe, but actually understand his messages. If you have not yet begun the study of neuropsychology, then you should do so now, sharing your time between this book and that study. Your knowledge in that area will be needed again, even more so later both in this book and in your practice of the chief exercise. It all relates directly to the following. As you know, the meaning of a word is elastic. After hearing a talk, several in the group of listeners will inadvertently remember parts of the talk incorrectly, unconsciously substituting a familiar synonym which they favour with its own elasticity for a word that was actually used in the talk, resulting in several different versions of the talk forwarded to the next group of listeners. That group will repeat the process and the next with more of the same with each new telling. Add to that a touch of wiseacring, and over a fairly short time the cumulative effect will be a version of the talk barely resembling the original. However, if we put the words of that talk to song, if we treat the words as the libretto of an aria and learn it well, we will remember the words with the notes of the melody exactly for a very long time. We have much more difficulty memorising part of a speech than a popular song, and once learned it is nearly impossible to recall the words of that song without also recalling the melody. That is because the words of the left breast and melody of the right breast are learned together. In this process the words are, so to speak, now to the notes of the melody and the melody to the words, and they can be separated only with great difficulty. You will find it difficult in the extreme to recall the lyrics of a song you know without automatically recalling the tune. For instance, try to recall the words only of any Christmas song that comes to mind. You'll find the tune tags along with the words. The converse is also true. Try to hum any well-known tune without also recalling the lyrics. It is almost impossible. Given that reality, I could create a song from a story or a talk I heard, and by singing my song to and then with you, you could learn that song and, after repeating it several times, a day for a month, you could recall that song word for word and note for note years or even decades later. You could then teach that song to your children and grandchildren, and they in turn could teach it to theirs. But that tradition of putting legend into song form, as good as it may have once been, will not help today, and Gurdjieff was aware of that. After this occurrence, when the beneficent result of the impressions formed in my childhood from the narratives of my father finally became clear to me, a result that crystallized in me a spiritualizing factor enabling me to comprehend that which usually appears incomprehensible. I often regretted having begun too late to give the legends of antiquity the immense significance that I now understand they really have. There are several centres of gravity there, especially impressions formed in my childhood, perhaps not all of which are beneficent in our case, which are related to our small experiment and eating red peppers. But here we focus on Gurdjieff's remark that legends of antiquity have immense significance. Making a template. Realising that it was already too late for him to benefit fully from the ritual singing of legends, Gurdjieff certainly knew we would not benefit either. And so the primary question again arises, which is why? Why did Gurdjieff include that useless information in his writings? Perhaps because it gives us a template. It demonstrates us something that, if we can learn from that example and extrapolate from one medium to another, will be of immense significance. The same accuracy and stability found in the Ashok's ritualistic transmission of words, coupled with melody, holds for any ritualized form built on a similar template, complex physical ritual exercises included. And that stability is the result of a similar pairing. Just as the ritual singing of the Ashoks was stabilized by combining a left breast function words with a right breast function melody, the stability of the physical ritual exercise we seek is also achieved by the interwoven learning of our two breasts of a virgin. As the movements of the chief exercise require the coordination of both left and right parts of the body, arms, hands, legs and feet, it is learned by our first two totalities working together as one, and when long practiced and well learned, the ritual is almost impossible to forget, neither is it subject to casual change or revision. Thus, teachings based on that template can and have survived far beyond the normal 3 generations lifespan of oral teachings, and like the songs of the Ashoks, the chief exercises remain stable and largely unchanged for at least 4,000 years, though in all probability for much longer than that. Now, how do you think Gurdjieff could convey such an exercise to us? How could he describe the ritual exercise in such a way that would be useful for these unfortunates, and yet avoid intrusion and interference by the power-possessing beings, Hasnamasses, joiners and such like? Perhaps by his favourite, his primary mode of speech. Chapter 10. Picture Form Language. The best way to communicate the moves of a dance, or a sacred dance-like ritual, is by demonstration, so that the postures and moves can be seen and imitated. And the best way to relate such a ritual in a book is by use of photographs or an included video that everyone can easily see and imitate the moves. But if it is inappropriate for just anyone to see, as in this case, then picture form language is best. In the writings of Gurdjieff, this ritualized chief exercise is one of the most important of his messages. At least it is the most important for us at this time. While becoming familiar with the Podobnosarnian style of writing is a required intermediate step. It is primarily used in his second series to give us something of the direction in which his books are leading, Life is Real, page 4, while also mentioning some of the details involved, for instance, the body parts. Yet when it comes to informing these unfortunates of its identity, picture form language is best. But until we have become very familiar with this language, we will have difficulty sorting out those passages from others. Knowing this, Gurdjieff gives instruction on how to recognise sections written in picture form language. He gives this help almost directly and means it to be taken literally. However, it does contain a few extra words for the purpose of concealment from the uninitiated. From Life is Real, page 69. Expecting with indubitable certainty that this series of my expositions, as I have already said, will be really edifyingly instructive, that is to say, will serve if only for the automatic formation in those creatures of our common Father, similar to myself, of data of all kinds, which ought to be, according to my understanding, present in a real man, and not only of such data which are generally formed in the common presence of people, especially the contemporary ones, making them quite will-less, manifesting themselves in every way like mere animals, exclusively through the reflexes of the functioning of their organism. I want, right from the very beginning of this series, to speak also of such external facts, the description of which for a naive reader might appear at first sight almost a meaningless mere succession of words, whereas for a man who has the habit of thinking and searching for the sense contained in so-called allegorical expositions, on condition of a little strengthened mentation, they will be full of inner significance, and, if he makes the slightest effort not to be a puppet of his automatic reflection, he will grasp and learn very much. As we have seen before, so here again Gurdjieff's real meaning is buried under mounds of words. By my computer's word count function, in that one long sentence he uses 196 words, but we need only 4 of those words. In my opinion, that is pretty good cover. Let's use the old boil it down or line through method to simplify the excerpt. That is where you use a pencil, so that your lines are erasable, and strike through every word you think you can do without until you have boiled it down to a small residue of its former self. On your first time through by removing extraneous words and thoughts, preparatory and follow-up phases, you will easily cut the number of words in half and then reduce them by another half on your second time through. By your third or fourth effort, this meaning should begin to emerge and make better sense. Keep going until you have only 4 or 5 words left. Then string these words together to make a coherent phrase, which is a description of how sections written in picture form language will appear. That small residue of words will show you how to identify places where he employs the most important method used to convey his most important teachings, which is picture form language. Go ahead and get a pencil, and using the line through method, reduce Gurdjieff's 196 words to a residue of a handful, because much of what we cover later will depend on your ability first to recognise and then to interpret his picture form writings correctly, which is not as simple as it may seem. As I have by long and very hard experience learned, and will later in this book sorely bemoan, recognising Gurdjieff's picture form sections and correctly interpreting them are 2 entirely different skills. Chapter 11. The sorry state of higher being parts. Focus is a good thing as long as it isn't overdone. When overdone, we develop a mental tunnel vision in which we miss a great deal. On the other hand, a broad perspective is also good and is very difficult to overdo. In fact, the broad perspective of completed Keshjan is one of our primary goals. In our study of Gurdjieff's writings, we sometimes become too focused on what he says or what we think he says in his books. That is to say, we become book-bound. Far too often we just nod our heads and accept one of his remarks without expanding on it, without pondering how it may relate to our past or current, much less future position. We tend to rely too much on what is said in his books and not enough on our ability to extrapolate from what is said and actually think things through. All of which is to say, we sometimes fall into a state of complacency where we lack the initiative required in the 4th way. But I recently stumbled over yet another of Gurdjieff's little hints, somehow became fascinated with it, and so began to expand on it by asking a series of what-ifs. Those what-ifs have helped loosen up my rather constricted by the book thinking. You may find it useful as well. For instance, in the past, I, along with many others, have assumed that upon completing Keshjan body and getting down to the work of perfecting highest body things will be, as our esteemed Mullah Nasir-ed-Din says in a grand parody of our naivety, just roses, roses. But what if, that assumption is not justified. Gurdjieff teaches that all of the cosmoses are the same, as above, so below, the difference being in scale. Life is Real, page 223, Beelzebub's Tales, page 775. If we work with that, if we expand on that a little further, we will see that the sameness of the cosmoses, at least to some extent, confirms the converse, as below, so above. Given that state of affairs, we have a wealth of information from our real experience to help us better grasp the overall scheme of things. Using what we know from personal experience and other nearby learning, we can merge information given by Gurdjieff on higher matters with what we know of lower matters. For instance, from Beelzebub's Tales, chapter 39. The point is that according to various second-grade cosmic laws, the being-body Gurdjieff cannot exist long in this sphere, and at the end of a certain time, this second being part must decompose, irrespective of whether the high being part existing within it had by that time attained the requisite degree of reason. And in view of the fact that as long as this higher being part does not perfect its reason to the requisite degree, it must always be dependent upon some Gurdjieffian arising or other. Therefore, immediately after the second sacred Razku Anu, every such still unperfected higher being body gets into a state called Tek Gek Danal, or searching for some other similar two-natured arising corresponding to itself. So that when the higher part of this other two-natured arising perfects itself to the required degree of reason, and the final process of the sacred Razku Anu occurs to it, and the speedy disintegration of its Gurdjieff body is not yet clearly sensed, this higher being body might instantly enter this other body Gurdjieff and continue to exist in it for its further perfection, which perfection must sooner or later be inevitably accomplished by every arisen higher being body. Seems to me the remark that every still unperfected higher being body gets into a state over what amounts to a housing shortage describes us when we try to buy a house before someone else scoops it up and takes it off the market, or our lease on a rented apartment or house has expired and we must find another dwelling to inhabit rather quickly. The situation for unperfected higher being bodies whose Gurdjieffian housing is about to expire is similar. That is a loose approximation of our occasional housing predicament when compared to that of higher bodies. But we can apply our experience not just to higher realms but to lower, just as we might find ourselves in a tizzy over finding a new home. Many lower life forms experience something similar. We will take hermit crabs as an example. As these crabs outgrow the mollusk shell they call home, they must find new and larger accommodation. Having no resort to real estate agents, they must find new shells on their own. And since for them possession is not just 9/10 but 10/10 of the law, they sometimes have to jostle and struggle among themselves for their new dwellings. They must compete for their new home. We, in spite of being of a higher order, sometimes find ourselves competing for new living space, but we generally limit our competition to higher bids, under the table bonuses, lawsuits and such. Still, competition for a new dwelling is often vigorous for both hermit crabs and we free-brained beings. All of that makes me wonder whether there is similar competition in the realm of unperfected higher beings. After all, they are not yet perfected, they are not saints, and they will be found in various stages of development, in the octave of self-perfecting, with some higher and some lower. Alarmingly, some of those unperfected higher parts may even be Hasnamusses, who Gurdjieff says may also have Gurdjieff body and even soul. Given the diversity of those unperfected higher being parts, I am not at all sure those about to be homeless higher beings will in every case exhibit the gentlemanly attitude of, "Oh, that's all right, old boy. Although I was here first, really, I'm in no hurry, so you go ahead and take that Keshjan body. I'll just hang around here without a home for a while. I'm not sure they would take that tact, because the higher parts of which we speak are not yet perfected, and worse, some may even be Hasnamusses. All of which makes for a possible situation implied by Gurdjieff and described in an ancient Chinese curse as interesting. But in view of the reality reflected in the truism as above so below, and its converse, what if there is a system in place there, resembling what we often find here, in crowded stores and offices, where we are greeted not by a person but by a printed sign instructing us to please take a number and wait. As such, impersonal treatment is not welcome by us. I do not expect it would go over very well with those unperfected higher being bodies, especially when they have gotten into a state over finding a previously owned, used Keshjan body. Perhaps that would explain why, in an exceedingly strange remark at the end of chapter 15, Beelzebub indicates the existence of, and presumably the need for, the office of bailiff among his tribe of advanced beings. I believe that would be bailiff in the British sense of the word. Now, if you will please, pardon those harebrained scenarios from my clearly diseased mind, just delete them from your memory. Presto, presto. Then you come up with a scenario or two of your own. The point is, by applying what we know based on our own real experience to what Gurdjieff says, we will at least broaden our perspective. We should do that because, as it seems to me, and as indicated by hints dropped by Gurdjieff such as Tek Gek Danal, we will need a broader perspective sooner or later. It is best that we become prepared in advance of that need. As we leave the topic of strange situations, our highest being parts may encounter there is another seldom considered issue that may be interesting, which is, where do Keshjan bodies, those Keshjans that are somewhat developed but not yet completed, reside in the interior between recurrences? After they are formed and have reached perhaps the second or third scale step in Keshjan's octave of development, and have gone through the first sacred Razkuanu yet again, where do they then dwell as they await recurrence? Is there a waiting room or nursery for Keshjans waiting to be born again? Do they just float around up there somewhere, or are there special places, perhaps a fourth way place where we may reside, sponsored and given more instruction and work? I think Gurdjieff addresses some of those issues fairly well in his books, especially Beelzebub's Tales, but usually in places where he seems to be talking about some planet or other, or perhaps a strange place on this one. Gurdjieff gives more detailed and written explanations than we realise. He tells us how much better Keshjan's second kind of reason is in comparison to our normal third kind of reason. He also tells us the exact size and shape of Keshjan. We will get to such answers later. Here we are more concerned with finding the right type of questions to ask in loosening up our thinking. A really disturbing thought, one that helped shake me out of my complacency, pertains to the question of what happens to a Keshjan of lower development. One, for instance, like the Good Brigand, who Gurdjieff says may have become an immortal thing. He followed no way, and so had no sponsors. Prior to recurrence are such Keshjans as that immortal thing kept in a special facility for wayward beings, overseen by our previously mentioned bailiff. What do you think? As opposed to our just Rose's view of the future, the current condition of our Keshjan body in its stage of development are of major concern. We must work on completing Keshjan not tomorrow, not there and then, but here and now, while we still have the advantage of a physical body. Our body is a great asset. With all of its wants, desires and laziness, it provides us with a very good training partner, one with and against whom we may struggle if we are willing. Perhaps a little here and a little there, and gradually more, we will make better use of our training partner while we still have him. All in all, such considerations indicate that from here and now to there and then, we shall have an eventful journey with much to learn and a long way to go. As to how far we highly developed free-brained beings still have to go, Gurdjieff gives several hints, two of which I will just mention and leave further elaboration to you. Whereas in the above excerpt Gurdjieff offers a lesson on similarities between beings of different levels of the cosmos, in other cases he emphasizes the differences between them and us. Several examples of that great difference are found in chapter 16 of Beelzebub's Tales, The Relative Understanding of Time. Given Gurdjieff's propensity for hiding his true meaning behind something else, it is possible that chapter is not as much concerned with time as it is with differences in being, and time is just a measuring stick. Compared to the higher powers, perhaps we are the minuscule beings in the decanter of water mentioned by Beelzebub. You will find the last several pages of the chapter especially interesting. In another example of differences, one far too close for comfort for this writer, while speaking of his travels in Tibet, chapter 22, Beelzebub casually remarks, "Having rested and fed our biped and quadruped workers, I'm pretty sure that by biped workers he does not mean chickens. More likely Gurdjieff means us as something like chickens when compared to Beelzebub." That unflattering description will apply to all free-brained beings, including patriarch Not's unfortunates, unless these unfortunates have the good fortune to be actively working on themselves and have not become stuck as Mr. Pinder's wagoner, in which case the quadruped workers clearly have the more enviable position. In our use of what-ifs, we have ranged on the topic of housing shortages from the lower realm of hermit crabs up to and including the realm of higher being bodies, and we have found some analogues of our experience in both the lower and higher realms. But what if that applies not just to housing issues, but to other situations, and what if it doesn't stop with unperfected higher beings, but further continues up the scale of the cosmoses to whatever comes next? We'll explore those possibilities in later chapters. As previously said, we must find a way to make our Keshjan strong, stronger than both personality and essence. With regard to that, you may find a passage from Life is Real, page 15, interesting. It has to do with the idea that being confined in a place infested with fleas and lice is a very good thing as a preliminary education for the future life. If that reflects the future life of one with a weak Keshjan, then I think it would be a good idea to begin to make our weak friend much, much stronger. Gurdjieff has a little more to say on that matter, which we will cover soon. Such off-the-beaten-path musings, gently suggested by Gurdjieff's barely noticeable little hints such as "gets into a state" and "bailiff," among dozens of others, may help us loosen up, get unstuck, and broaden our perspective, which will be useful not only with his third series in general, but particularly useful and even required in the work of finding and understanding, not to forget the long practice of Gurdjieff's chief exercise. But all that is just my opinion. Why don't we see what Gurdjieff has to say about it? Gurdjieff on trans-space thinking. In support of some of the notions offered in this chapter, let's see what Gurdjieff says about strange thinkings. This comes from Fragments, page 207 to 8. The idea of the possibility of broadening man's consciousness and increasing his capacities for knowledge stands in direct relation to the teaching on cosmoses. In his ordinary state, a man is conscious of himself in one cosmos, and all the other cosmoses he looks at from the point of view of one cosmos. The broadening of his consciousness and the intensifying of his psychic functions lead him into the sphere of activity and life of two other cosmoses simultaneously, the one above and the one below, that is, one larger and one smaller. The broadening of consciousness does not proceed in one direction only, that is, in the direction of the higher cosmoses, in going above. At the same time it goes below. This last idea will perhaps explain to you some expressions you have met with in occult literature. For instance, the saying that the way up is at the same time the way down. As a rule, this expression is quite wrongly interpreted. In reality, this means that if, for instance, a man begins to feel the life of the planets, or if his consciousness passes to the level of the planetary world, he begins at the same time to feel the life of atoms, or his consciousness passes to their level. In this way, the broadening of consciousness proceeds simultaneously in two directions, towards the greater and towards the lesser. Both the great and the small require for their cognition a like change in man. In looking for parallels and analogies between the cosmoses, we may take each cosmos in three relations. First, in its relation to itself. Second, in its relation to a higher or a larger cosmos. And third, in its relation to a lower or a smaller cosmos. The manifestations of the laws of one cosmos in another cosmos constitutes what we call a miracle. There can be no other kind of miracle. A miracle is not a breaking of laws, nor is it a phenomenon outside laws. It is a phenomenon which takes place according to the laws of another cosmos. These laws are incomprehensible and unknown to us, and are therefore miraculous. We have already found some good application of what he says about miracles, and we will find even more a little later. Then Gurdjieff finishes up with, in order to understand the laws of relativity, it is very useful to examine the life and phenomena of one cosmos as though we're looking at them from another cosmos, that is, to examine them from the point of view of the laws of another cosmos. All the phenomena of the life of a given cosmos, examined from another cosmos, assume a completely different aspect and have a completely different meaning. Many new phenomena appear and many other phenomena disappear. This, in general, completely changes the picture of the world and of things. For instance, when looking at the Buddha from the point of view of this cosmos, with our severely limited third kind of reason, we see only the great Saint Buddha. But with a more highly developed Gurdjieff, or when looked at from the fourth way's point of view, perhaps we will see a little better. We will cover some of the rather surprising insights of that point of view in a later chapter. Meanwhile, Gurdjieff gives license and encourages us to think not only outside of the box, but even outside of the world as we know it. This freedom applies not only to our understanding of Gurdjieff's writings, which are themselves a bit out of the ordinary, but to life itself. If we are to ever get out of the box of our recurring lives, we must learn to think outside of that box, not just in reading books, but day to day. Recalling that the new Orage, which new and old Orage I will explain later, has said that the trans-space ship Karnak is not a trans-space ship, but represents the human body, us. Consider the following from Beelzebub's Tales, page 51. It was in the year 223, after the creation of the world, through the universe flew the ship Karnak of the trans-space communication. We must learn to think as the Karnak flew. We must learn to think and communicate in trans-space, which is to say, through and across realms. Chapter 12, Lest You Grow Impatient. Unfortunates who have Gurdjieff of almost any level of development may have a few intuitive memories, perhaps intuited or felt only vaguely, memories of lessons learned, lessons missed and lost opportunities, due to which they will have a more serious attitude and a better grasp of the need for complete and thorough preparation. Others, perhaps the majority reading Gurdjieff's and Ouspensky's books, and a wide variety of other books, will not take the need for thorough preparation seriously, and so will grow impatient with all of the, to their thinking, unnecessary background and preparatory material being covered. They will be growing impatient to get on with the hunt to find the chief exercise. Just let me at it, they will think. Even some of these unfortunates will feel that way at least a little. But in their heart of hearts they already know better, intuitively taking the need for preparation more seriously and realising that if it were easy they would have already accomplished their goal. They will be better prepared for the work to follow. The preparations are not options, they are required. Putting that into some kind of numerical relation initially, in my usually imprecise opinion, the preparation should take approximately 80% of your time and efforts, and finding the chief exercise about 20%. Those figures could be 60% to 40% for some, or 90 to 10% for others. It will vary depending on the level of preparations already achieved by each individual. But the preparation should be weighed at least as heavily as finding the exercise. Ideally for a person who has already achieved a major portion of the preparations, if such persons actually exist, the ratio can be close to 50-50. In any event, the preparations cannot be ignored or put off until later. You must realise that finding and beginning practice of the exercise before you are sufficiently prepared is one of the worst things that could happen to you. As I have said, without sufficient preparation the exercise will have little, if any, effect. Imagine two men, each searching for the chief exercise. The first of these two men takes the preparation required seriously, and so spends a good part of his days studying, as advised, in making music, per Gurdjieff's bizarre instructions, and in working with our small experiment in learning to control his imagination. The second man skips all of that and focuses solely on finding the chief exercise, and so has more time devoted to that. He may find the identity of the exercise in 2 or 3 days or a week, well before the first man, but it will do him little good because of the converse of Gurdjieff's remark. The more a man understands what he is doing, the greater will be the benefit, which of course means the less a man understands what he is doing, ... Without the required preparations, the second man, having found it in quick time, will work only on the mechanics of the exercise with no real understanding of the internals. Getting no quick results, he will soon decide that it is of no use and abandon it, blaming the exercise for its lack of results. The first man, having begun and continued the preparations advised by Gurdjieff and the elders, may find the exercise 2 or 3 weeks or months later, long after the second man, but he will be better prepared. He will know what to expect, and when he begins the exercise he will make real and steady progress. Now, in spite of a superficial resemblance, the above description is not a restatement of the old tortoise and hare story, because we are, or we have, both the hare and the tortoise as our first 2 totalities of functioning. The second is quick and facile, while the first is more ponderous and contains that which is more real in us. It also contains real wish. In order to win this race, in order to reach the finish line of completed Keshjan, those 2 must work together, not too fast and not too slow. They must work in tandem through our third totality of functioning. In any event, we should all, even the eager beavers among us, realise the simple fact that if we could benefit from just being told of the exercise, then Gurdjieff could have done that long ago. But that would not be effective. We must first, by the preparations indicated, make ourselves ready. That is why he arranged his writings so that we have to struggle to begin to see what he is saying. Then struggle more to see his instruction on the final preparations. Then, after struggling to accomplish these preparations, we can count ourselves privileged to be able to struggle yet again in order to see his picture-form instructions on the chief exercise, and begin to perform that sacred ritual on a regular and daily basis. And that is when the real struggle will begin. The fourth way is not an easy way where we can be just taught by some authority, or even read about it for ourselves and then just believe what we have read or been told. Because belief, which is easy, is not understanding. And in the fourth way, understanding is essential. Nothing about the true fourth way is easy, and it will never be easy because we are swimming upstream. We are going against the natural order, against the flow of the expanding universe, and worse, against our own habits and preferences with which we will have become entirely too comfortable. That, our fondness of the status quo, is or will be the main force working just beneath our consciousness against our evolution. We will visit with that again later. Not only that, which is bad enough, but our task is especially difficult due to the fact that in nature there are no straight lines, at least not for long. As Gurdjieff explains in Fragments, page 127 to 130, although we may begin work in a straight line, we soon deviate according to law, and without our even knowing it, all our efforts eventually turn in on themselves and we wind up back where we started. As I have said in describing my early practice of the exercise, I would perform it in a straight line for a few months or a year, and then something would intervene and I would stop, only later getting back to it and beginning again. That happened over and over. Lack of consistency was the one constant in my practice. Only when I finally discovered its great importance, the goal and potential results of the exercise, did I begin another straight line performance, and this one has lasted 6 years. But you will not believe how difficult it has been, and it will be difficult for you as well. As an example, take the most difficult thing you ever seen or heard about, such as climbing Mount Everest or winning the Olympic decathlon. Just as training and preparation are required in mountain climbing and sports, it is likewise required in the fourth way. Now you may think yourself to be the exception, but in spite of what you may have been taught by TV, Hollywood and fairy tales, such persons do not exist except in fantasy. No one is the exception. It is as Gurdjieff says in the fourth way, all are equally beggars and all will struggle. He knew how great the struggle would be, and so has provided a bit of encouragement for those who, in spite of having made real and perhaps at times very strong efforts, will occasionally reach a period of difficulty, or what Patriarch Knott calls the doldrums. Seafarers in the days of great sailing ships encountered such doldrums where their sails lost the wind and they became becalmed. I have been recently becalmed and had to struggle greatly to overcome it. In your work on yourself it will happen to you. Gurdjieff alerts us to this in a talk from Fragments, page 129. What happens is that gradually the way out becomes lost. In the pages preceding this excerpt, he has been talking about deflection. Deflection points in octaves of all sorts where there is an impediment between two steps of the scale, such as the interval between me and far. You should read the previous 2 or 3 pages leading up to these remarks and try to understand, because if you are human, no matter how eagerly and enthusiastically you initially pursue your practice on the exercise, you will fall victim to the full plethora of human frailties. It helps to know about that in advance. Gurdjieff said, such a course of things, that is, a change of direction, we can observe in everything. After a certain period of energetic activity or strong emotion or a right understanding, a reaction comes. Work becomes tedious and tiring. Moments of fatigue and indifference enter into feeling. Instead of right thinking, a search for compromises begins. Suppression, evasion of difficult problems. But the line continues to develop, though now not in the same direction as at the beginning. Work becomes mechanical, feeling becomes weaker and weaker, descends to the level of the common events of the day. Thought becomes dogmatic, literal. Everything proceeds in this way for a certain time. Then again there is reaction, again a stop, again a deviation. The development of the force may continue, but the work which was begun with great zeal and enthusiasm has become an obligatory and useless formality. A number of entirely foreign elements have entered into feeling, considering, vexation, irritation, hostility. Thought goes round in a circle, repeating what was known before, and the way out which had been found becomes more and more lost. When I entered my becalmed period, I was quite down in the mouth and disheartened, thinking that after so many years of really hard work and study, I was about to fail in this most important of Gurdjieff's teachings. I very much needed a boost, and luckily I found it in Gurdjieff's above remarks. By his remarks I realised I was not failing, but just going through an unexpected and predictable trouble spot, a trouble spot that can be overcome. Then, recalling Gurdjieff's remark that all are beggars, I realised that the small but real difference between me and my former self was not due to some privileged superior mind or innate talent, but due only to the work and the super efforts I had been making. That was enough to get me back to work. Gurdjieff's words gave me the attitude adjustment needed to get over that trouble spot and continue my long journey. Perhaps his words will help you when your sails lose the wind. We must work patiently, as he several times says, without regard for results. If you do the work, the results will inevitably come in their own good time. And so, as he very wisely advises, we should learn to love work. When you are tired and worn out, it may help to realise that real work on oneself is a privilege, and very, very few will ever have even the slightest opportunity of engaging in that work. If you wish to be among those few, then learn to appreciate the rare opportunity, and then learn to love work.